The disappearance of Alfred Beilhartz occurred in early July 1938 while the child was out camping with his family in Rocky Mountain National Park to celebrate Independence Day weekend. Despite one of the most extensive search operations of the era, which included the diversion of a major river, no physical trace of the boy was ever found. What makes this case particularly interesting is the credible sighting reported the following day of a young boy matching Alfred's description perched on a high, inaccessible ridge known as Devil's Nest, 6 miles away and 3,000 feet higher in elevation than where he disappeared. In the summer of 1938, America was navigating the tail end of the Great Depression. For families like Alfred's from Denver, camping in national parks offered an accessible and low-cost summer reprieve from city life. William Beilhartz was a factory worker with a large family of 10 children, and he lived at 3225 Quebec Street in Denver, Colorado. Alfred, aged 4, was among the youngest of the children. The family was accustomed to the outdoors, and the trip to Rocky Mountain National Park was intended to be a celebratory trip over Independence Day weekend. They traveled with some friends and established their campsite roughly a quarter-mile west of the Fall River Lodge, situated just south of what is now the current Lawn Lake Trailhead parking lot. The camping party was positioned near where the Roaring River and Fall River met, just below Horseshoe Falls, an area that, while popular with campers, is known for its dense willows, rocky terrain, and swift-moving waters. Understanding the geography is critical to understanding the impossibility of the case's details. The park is located approximately 76 miles northwest of Denver International Airport in north-central Colorado, nestled within the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. The eastern and western slopes of the Continental Divide run directly through the center of the park, with the headwaters of the Colorado River located in the park's northwestern region. The location of the campsite sat at an elevation of approximately 8,500 feet, surrounded by steep, imposing peaks and dense vegetation. The Roaring River lives up to its name, particularly in early July when snowmelt from the high peaks swells the currents. The river is turbulent, cold, and loud enough that cries for help would be drowned out by its roar. The banks were lined with dense willow thickets and pine forests, creating a visual barrier that could obscure a small child within steps. At the time, a 26-foot-high earthen dam had been constructed to enhance Lawn Lake to help with crop irrigation in the Loveland area. The trip consisted of William, his wife, and their large group of 11 children, as well as some family friends named the Bronsons. The group established their campsite in a location that was both beautiful and inherently chaotic. They pitched their tents near the convergence of the Fall River and the Roaring River. The large group woke to a cool, crisp air on July 2nd, and the camp was immediately bustling with activity. Alfred, described as a small, somewhat frail child for his age but energetic, was dressed in faded blue denim overalls, a light-colored shirt, and somewhat worn-out shoes that were slightly too large for his feet. This detail about his shoes is significant as it suggests that walking long distances or climbing steep, rocky terrain would have been physically difficult and uncomfortable for him. Around mid-morning, tragedy struck. Alfred's father, William, decided to head to the nearby stream to wash up for the day. Seeing his father leave, Alfred asked to tag along, to which William agreed. The destination was a spot on the banks of the Roaring River, approximately 500 feet from the tents. This was a short walk, likely taking no more than 2 or 3 minutes. When William and Alfred arrived at the water's edge, they were not alone. 2 neighborhood boys who had joined the camping trip, Oran Bronson and Walter Hansen, were already at the river washing their faces and hands. The water of the riverbank moved fast, tumbling over slick rocks. The banks are lined with the aforementioned willows and brush, creating pockets of visibility and obscurity. William proceeded to wash his face and hands in the icy water as Alfred stood nearby. Accounts differ slightly on whether Alfred actively washed up or simply played near the edge, but he was reportedly within arm's reach of his father during this process. The presence of 2 other boys provided a false sense of security. With 3 older individuals present, the amount of supervision seemed more than adequate. Once William finished washing, he prepared to head back to the campsite to help with the rest of the morning's preparations. According to William's later testimony to park rangers and the sheriff, he turned to Alfred, saying that it was time to leave. However, the boy wanted to stay a bit longer. He expressed an intent to join the other boys who were located slightly upstream, who were maybe 200 feet away. Trusting that Alfred was safe in the company of the older boys and being only 500 feet from the campsite, William allowed Alfred to stay at the river. William arrived back at the campsite after about 5 minutes and expected Alfred to show up shortly after him. But as minutes went by and there was no sign of the boy, William got up and asked around for Alfred. He first asked his wife and kids, but they all looked at him confused, replying that they hadn't seen him. Worried, William decided to make his way back to the river to check on Alfred, but when he returned, there was no sign of his son. Oran and Walter were still at the riverbank, so William approached them and asked where Alfred was. The two boys replied that they never saw him after William left. William immediately became frantic and scoured the nearby area for Alfred. The first fear was the water. William scanned the turbulent surface of the roaring river. If Alfred had fallen in, the current was swift enough to sweep a small body downstream instantly. However, there had been no scream. No splash was heard by the boys nearby, though the roar of the river could have masked the sounds. If he hadn't fallen, he must have wandered into the willows. The dense brush was a labyrinth for a 4-year-old. A child could step 3 feet off the trail and be completely invisible. After checking these locations, William ran back to the campsite, alerting his wife and the rest of the family. The calm morning dissolved into chaos. The entire party fanned out, shouting Alfred's name. The family searched for approximately 45 minutes to an hour. They checked the trail, the riverbanks, and the immediate perimeter of the camp. They looked for footprints in the mud near the water, but found nothing definitive. The lack of footprints was the first anomaly. If he fell in, there should have been a slide mark or a print near the edge. If he walked away, his shoes should have left impressions in the soft earth near the riparian zone. However, there was nothing. Realizing that the situation was beyond their control and with the terror of the river looming large, the family made the decision to seek help. They rushed to the Fall River Ranger Station, located nearby. They made contact with Ranger Jack Moomaw, who was an experienced woodsman and tracker, a man who knew the terrain of the park intimately. Jack contacted the Civilian Conservation Corps camp located within the park. In 1938, the CCC was an integral part of park operations, providing a ready-made force of young, fit men capable of arduous physical labor. Within 45 minutes of the alert being raised, a truckload of CCC enrollees arrived at the confluence. The first priority remained the water. Men were dispatched downstream to watch the currents, while another group formed lines to sweep the woods. As the sun climbed higher on July 2nd, the mystery deepened. The timeline dictated that Alfred could not have gone far. A 4-year-old boy in loose shoes, traversing dense thickets and rocky ground, travels slowly. In the 15 minutes he was unaccounted for, he theoretically could only have traveled a radius of perhaps a quarter mile. On Monday, July 4th, conservation members and other volunteers continued combing the area for any sign of Alfred. Bloodhounds from the Colorado State Prison were brought into the park to aid the search effort. However, the behavior of these dogs introduced the first major detail to the case. Instead of tracking Alfred's scent into the water, which would confirm the drowning hypothesis, the dogs reportedly picked up a scent that led away from the river. According to reports, the dogs tracked the scent approximately 500 feet uphill into the dense timber before stopping. Witnesses described the dogs acting nervous or confused at the point the trail ended. They did not circle as if searching for the subject. Rather, the scent simply vanished as if the source had been lifted from the ground. Even more troubling to investigators was the observation that there were no footprints where the dogs tracked the scent, a detail that remains unexplained and is frequently cited in modern analyses as evidence against a simple wandering off scenario. Because drowning was considered the primary theory, the search focused heavily on the water. Nets and traps were installed downstream to catch a body if it drifted with the current. The search teams actually constructed a dam with sandbags, rocks, and logs to divert the flow of the roaring river. This allowed them to drain sections of the riverbed to scour the bottom for a body caught in snags or rocks. Rangers used grappling hooks and pikes to systematically search the riverbed. Despite their extensive efforts on July 5th, nothing was found. Not a single shoe, piece of clothing, or personal item was recovered. When this produced no results, searchers set up a wire net near the Fall River to catch any evidence that might be swept downstream. This net returned no results either, so they gave up searching the river. The parents, William and his wife, told the Rangers that they were sure their son must have been abducted. They knew their son wouldn't leave his family and were skeptical that he had simply fallen into the water. By Wednesday, July 6th, the search of the river had ended, leaving searchers frustrated and confused. They continued to search the land, and by Thursday, 200 searchers told news reporters they were convinced he had never drowned and had either gotten lost in the forest or had been kidnapped. The searchers reasoned that if the boy had fallen into the roaring river, his body could not have passed all 5 of the beaver dams in the area and reached the Fall River. Even if it had somehow managed to pass those obstacles, they argued it could not have passed the wire net. The search was eventually called off after 10 days, leaving numerous questions unanswered. As news spread of the missing boy, some witnesses came forward with interesting information. They were William J. Ells, a radio appliance employee from Denver, and his wife. They were ordinary, working-class citizens enjoying the Independence Day weekend, much like the Beilhartz family who had camped just miles away. On the morning of Sunday, July 3rd, the couple were unaware that a child was missing. The frantic search operation was concentrated on the valley floor near the roaring river, miles away from where William and his wife were hiking. They were not consciously scanning the landscape looking for a boy. This lack of prior knowledge and expectation lends significant weight to their testimony. They reported what they saw without the bias of suggestion or the tendency to fill in details based on what they expected to find. They were tourists on a leisurely hike, not searchers with preconceived notions. The Ells were hiking near Mount Chapin, a large 12,454-foot peak in the Mummy Range that dominates the skyline of the northern portion of Rocky Mountain National Park. Their route took them along the old Fall River Road, a narrow, winding dirt road that was the first motor route constructed across the park's high country. This road provided access to dramatic vistas, but was also a challenging drive even by modern standards. From a vantage point near the road, they looked up toward a distinctive rock formation known locally as Devil's Nest. Devil's Nest is a jagged, fortress-like, castellated ridge of rock, characterized by sharp peaks, deep crevices, and exposed stone faces. It sits on the slopes of Mount Chapin, featuring dangerous drops on multiple sides, expansive scree fields composed of loose, unstable rock, and exposure to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the high-altitude environment. The elevation of Devil's Nest exceeds 11,000 feet, placing it well into the alpine zone where vegetation is sparse and weather can change catastrophically within minutes. The linear distance from the Beilhartz campsite, located at approximately 8,500 feet in the valley of the Roaring River, to Devil's Nest is roughly 6 miles as measured in a straight line from point A to point B. However, the actual hiking distance would be considerably greater. More critically than the horizontal distance, the hike is not remotely flat. It involves an elevation gain of 2,500 to 3,000 feet. To contextualize this for those unfamiliar with mountaineering, this vertical ascent is equivalent to climbing the Empire State Building roughly 2.5 times, but on uncompacted dirt, exposed rock, and vegetated terrain that offers no stairs, railings, or assistance. The route would require navigating boulder fields, scrambling up rocky outcrops, and crossing streams swollen with snowmelt. The Ells had decided to stop and rest during their hike. The exact time was approximately 1 p.m. on Sunday, July 3rd. While pausing to catch their breath and survey the landscape around them, their eyes were drawn to the Devil's Nest formation. What they saw in that moment would transform the Beilhartz case from a straightforward tragedy into an enigma that defies rational explanation. Perched on the edge of the ridge at Devil's Nest was the silhouette of a small figure. It was unmistakably a young boy. The elves later described the boy as sitting motionless. They said he was positioned like a gargoyle. The two were close enough to the formation to distinguish that the figure was indeed a child, though they were too far away to make out specific facial features or clothing details with absolute clarity. However, their observation of the figure's movements suggests they had a clear enough view to read its behavior. When the boy noticed the hikers observing him, something odd occurred. The elves reported that the boy made a sudden jerking movement with his head to look at them. This was not a lazy or gradual turning. It was an abrupt, unsettling, mechanical-like motion. The boy's gaze locked onto them and he appeared to be watching them intently. Despite the apparent awareness of each other, no communication happened. He did not wave his arms to attract attention or call out for help, which would be the natural instinct for a lost boy. He simply looked at them with an intensity that one account describes as strange and detached. Some versions of the story include reference to a shrill noise or cry that coincided with the moment of the elves spotting the figure, though accounts vary on whether this cry emanated from the boy himself, was produced by the wind moving through the rocks, or was some other sound entirely. As the couple continued to watch, trying to make sense of the scene before them, the figure withdrew from view. Some accounts state that the boy simply stood up and walked back along the narrow ridge, disappearing behind a rock. Other versions suggest that he was pulled out of sight, implying that another figure may have been present just out of the line of sight. This distinction between retreating and being taken is significant, as it carries entirely different implications about the circumstances of the child's presence on Devil's Nest. As they made the drive back toward their lodging, they encountered the news about a missing child in the park. The couple realized with horror that what they had assumed was a climber's child or a tourist family's young hiker was likely the missing boy they had just heard about in the news. The child they had dismissed as belonging to a larger party that would certainly know to keep a close watch on him was, in fact, possibly a lost child. More disturbing still, the child had appeared alive, alert, and cognizant enough to notice and observe the elves, yet he had made no attempt to call for help. This realization transformed their casual observation into a crisis. They immediately sought out park rangers and provided them with detailed information about where and when they had seen the figure matching Alfred's description. The rangers to whom the elves reported their sighting were initially skeptical. The report required a suspension of disbelief that bordered on the supernatural, or at the very least, demanded an explanation for what seemed to defy the capabilities of a very small child. Despite the initial skepticism from experienced searchers, the testimony was deemed credible enough that the search commanders made the decision to shift significant resources from the river search to the high peaks. The testimony of two seemingly credible witnesses who claimed to have seen a boy matching the description at a very specific location was too important to dismiss, even if the sighting defied logical explanation. With the focus now shifted to Devil's Nest, a team of approximately 150 men, including expert climbers, mountaineers, and experienced park rangers, was dispatched to the Mount Chapin and Devil's Nest area. They checked the crevices and outcroppings where the elves said they had seen the boy. They searched the immediate area for any sign of a child. They looked for tracks, disturbances in the dust and rocks, broken vegetation, or any other physical evidence that would indicate a child had been present at that location. But the searchers found nothing. No footprints in the high-altitude dust or fine scree. No scuff marks on the lichen-covered rocks that would indicate climbing or scrambling. No blood, no torn clothing, no discarded shoes or items. If Alfred was genuinely present at Devil's Nest as the elves claimed to have seen, then he could not have gotten there alone. This realization led searchers and investigators toward the Mountain Man theory, a hypothesis that, while speculative, was the only theory that could physically explain how a 4-year-old appeared 3,000 feet above his last known location. According to this theory, a human, possibly a hermit living in the caves and rock shelters of the Mummy Range, or a disturbed individual hiding in the wilderness, had abducted Alfred from the riverbank shortly after he separated from his father. While this theory sounds like folklore straight out of nightmarish tales told around campfires, it was at the time and remains now one of the only somewhat reasonable theories that could explain how a 4-year-old appeared at such a location as Devil's Nest. Alternative explanations all heavily strained credibility. 8 days after Alfred's disappearance on July 8th, the FBI announced that it was performing forensic tests on a piece of soiled bandage that had been found in an abandoned cabin in the park. The disclosure of this finding was prompted by the insistence of the boy's parents that their son must have been abducted. Alfred had a blister on his foot when he vanished, and his mother had bandaged it using similar material. The discovery of the bandage reignited hope that their son might be alive, perhaps with someone who had taken him. However, the FBI's investigation into this lead did not produce any definitive results or public conclusions. On this same day, Mrs. C.A. Lynch, who lived in Big Spring, Nebraska, allegedly saw Alfred and a mysterious man walking along a highway together as she and her husband drove from Big Spring to Ogallala. She didn't know until the following day how important her sighting was when she was reading the newspaper and saw the photo of Alfred. She was adamant that the boy she saw on the highway was the same boy from the newspaper photograph, and she described them as walking together in a casual manner. She told her brother-in-law about her sighting, and he then went to speak to a Denver detective sergeant named Fred Renovati 2 days later on her behalf. This Nebraska sighting raised intriguing questions but also introduced geographical complications. If Alfred had been taken or had wandered as far as northwestern Nebraska, how had he traveled nearly 200 miles in such a short time? Nebraska officers investigated the sighting, but the man and boy reported by Lynch were never located and the lead went cold. Then on Sunday, November 27th, 1938, 5 months after the disappearance, William Beilhartz was sent a ransom note at their home in Denver. The message said, "Sorry for your son. We went west out of money. The boy doesn't take to us. We will return your son if you leave $500 in a can 1 block from your house and the note. We will return your son within 24 hours. The ransom demand of $500 was a significant sum in 1938, equivalent to over $10,000 in modern currency. The note was crude and taunting, providing no proof of life or any verifiable information that would prove the writer actually had Alfred. However, by November 29th, police were pretty sure that the note was a hoax. By November 30th, they confirmed that they had investigated 2 possible suspects, though they were not named publicly and were not formally charged. The line of inquiry quickly ended for reasons that have never been publicly explained. The family clung to the ransom note as evidence that Alfred had been abducted and might still be alive somewhere, but official investigators treated it as a cruel hoax, possibly perpetrated by someone who had read about the case in newspapers and saw an opportunity to capitalize on the family's grief. Ultimately, over 8 decades later, the case seems destined to remain unresolved. In recent years, David Paulides, author of the Missing 411 series, has popularized the Beilhartz case as a classic example of unexplained wilderness disappearances. David emphasizes specific profile points present in the case that he argues appear consistently across hundreds of national park disappearances. Rocky Mountain National Park is identified as a high-density zone for disappearances. Alfred vanished in proximity to water, a signature detail in many cases. The inexplicable gain in elevation at Devil's Nest is also cited as a signature of these cases. Small children are often found miles uphill from where they vanished, defying normal fatigue patterns and the expected behavior of lost children. The jerk motion and silence of the boy on the ridge are cited by David and others as exhibiting a trance-like or altered state that cannot be easily explained by normal circumstances. These observations have led some researchers to consider explanations that fall outside conventional criminology and wilderness survival science. In the early morning hours of March 17, 1995, 6 teenage boys vanished from Pickering, Ontario in a case that has since become one of Canada's most enduring and baffling missing persons mysteries. The boys included Jay Boyle, Chad Smith, Robbie Rumbold, Jamie Lefebvre, Michael Cummins, and Daniel Higgins, aged 16 to 18. The group left a party and was last known to have gone toward a local marina, where they allegedly stole 2 boats and headed out onto Lake Ontario. Despite one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history, no confirmed trace of the boys, the boats, or any significant physical evidence has ever been recovered. The combination of a complete lack of remains, gaps in surveillance footage, unidentified individuals at the marina, and early investigative missteps has fueled decades of debate over whether this was a tragic boating accident or something far more sinister. The evening of March 16, 1995 began as a typical spring break gathering for the group of teenagers. The basement party's atmosphere was reportedly casual, with the boys socializing among friends and acquaintances while consuming alcohol. Jay Boyle, at 17, was already a father to an infant daughter named Kiera, born to his girlfriend Monique. His presence at the party reflected his ongoing struggle to balance teenage social life with newfound adult responsibilities. At approximately 12:50 a.m. on March 17, 1995, the 6 boys made the decision to leave the party. According to accounts from other partygoers, they stated that they wanted to go goof off on a boat. The wording used suggests a spontaneous, potentially alcohol-influenced adventure rather than a carefully planned outing. The weather at the time on Lake Ontario was notoriously unforgiving, with water temperatures hovering just above freezing and capable of inducing hypothermia within minutes of immersion. The boys' lack of boating experience, combined with alcohol impairment and the darkness of early morning, created a dangerous situation. At 1:30 a.m., Jay made a critical phone call from a payphone to his girlfriend. This call has been documented as the last confirmed communication from any of the 6 boys. During the conversation, Jay asked Monique for permission to bring the group back to their shared apartment to continue drinking. This request indicates several important details. First, that the boys were still together as a group at this time, and second, that Jay maintained enough presence of mind to check with his girlfriend about using their apartment. Monique, who was home caring for their infant daughter, refused the request. The conversation was brief and Jay accepted her decision. The call ended with no indication of distress or changed plans, suggesting the boys simply moved on to their next idea. Investigators later established that this call originated from a payphone, placing Jay and presumably the other boys at a specific location in Pickering at 1:30 a.m. What makes this call particularly haunting is its timing. It occurred approximately 40 minutes after they left the party and roughly 18 minutes before the surveillance footage captured 3 of them entering East Shore Marina. This narrow window suggests the decision to go to the marina was made spontaneously after the call, or perhaps had been a backup plan if Monique refused their request. The call's content also contradicts theories that the boys were planning to run away, as it shows Jay attempting to maintain normal social patterns and seeking a familiar, safe location to continue the night. Just 18 minutes after the phone call, East Shore Marina's surveillance cameras captured 3 individuals entering the facility. The footage, which has been reviewed extensively by investigators, clearly shows Michael Cummins, Jamie Lefebvre, and Robbie Rumbolt passing through the marina's entrance area. The video is described as brief and grainy, and it offers no clear view of the boys' activities once inside the marina grounds. The absence of Jay Boyle, Chad Smith, and Danny Higgins from the surveillance footage has never been adequately explained, but several possibilities have been considered. The missing 3 might have already been inside the marina before the cameras began recording, or in an area not covered by the surveillance system. They also could have taken a different route that bypassed the camera's field of view. Perhaps the most intriguing and frustrating piece of evidence from the surveillance system involves the 3 individuals who appear in the footage immediately after the 3 boys enter the marina. According to analysis of the video, after Cummins, Lefebvre, and Rumbolt pass through the frame, the camera captures 2 females and 1 male entering the marina's service area. The timing suggests these individuals arrived at the marina very shortly after the boys. The male figure appears to gesture toward the females in a manner that has been described as deliberate, though the grainy, low-resolution quality of the footage makes it impossible to determine his facial expression, what he might be holding, or the exact nature of his gesture. The 2 females also remain unidentified, with no clear view of their faces or distinguishing features. These 3 people have long been considered crucial potential witnesses who may have seen the boys, interacted with them, or perhaps even been involved in whatever transpired at the marina. The fact that these 3 individuals have never been identified represents a significant investigative gap. For years, there was no widespread public appeal specifically focused on finding them, and they did not come forward voluntarily in the immediate aftermath of the case. Only decades later, as the case gained renewed attention through online platforms and anniversaries, did investigators and independent researchers begin emphasizing the importance of locating these witnesses. To date, they remain unknown, and their presence in the surveillance footage continues to fuel speculation about whether the boys encountered trouble at the marina itself. Between approximately 2:30 and 3 a.m., a crucial window of time opened during which the boys' fate was likely sealed. During this period, multiple residents living along the Pickering waterfront reported hearing the distinct sound of a motorboat engine operating on Lake Ontario. The reports were consistent enough to establish that a powered vessel was indeed active on the water during these early morning hours, and the sound appeared to emanate from the general direction of Frenchman's Bay, where East Shore Marina is located. No residents reported seeing the boat itself, which is understandable given the darkness of the hour and the distance from shore to the main boating channels. The 30-minute window during which the engine was heard indicates that the boat was operational for a significant period, perhaps traveling away from shore or moving along the coastline. The timing of these reports is critical. They place a motorboat on the water roughly 42 minutes to 72 minutes after the three boys were seen entering the marina. This would have allowed time for all 6 boys to potentially board the vessel, start the engine, and depart. However, the reports do not confirm who was on the boat, its exact location, or its direction of travel. The engine sounds eventually ceased, but whether this was because the boat traveled out of earshot, the engine was cut off, or a catastrophic event occurred remains unknown. By 3:30 a.m., approximately 2 hours after Jay's final phone call, concern among the boys' inner circle had escalated dramatically. The girlfriends of the missing teenagers, who had been trying to reach them by phone or pager, grew alarmed when all 6 boys remained out of contact. This was unusual behavior, especially given that Jay had specifically told Monique they would find something else to do after she refused them entry to the apartment. The complete radio silence from all 6 when they would typically check in or respond to messages signaled that something was wrong. The young women began contacting police to report their concerns. These initial calls represent the first official notification to law enforcement that the boys were missing. However, the police response at this hour would later be heavily criticized. Officers treated the situation as a typical case of teenagers staying out late and partying rather than as a potential emergency. They informed the callers that formal missing persons reports could only be filed by the boys' parents and that a waiting period was required before any action could be taken. This response effectively shut down any immediate search effort. The police declined to dispatch patrols to check likely locations, did not attempt to contact the boys themselves, and made no connection between the missing teens and the possibility of water-based trouble. The girlfriend's pleas, while earnest, were dismissed as a premature concern. The official investigation did not truly begin until Saturday afternoon, approximately 36 hours after the boys were last seen alive. It was at this point, during daylight hours on March 18, 1995, that police finally connected the missing persons reports filed by the boys' parents to the theft of 2 boats from East Shore Marina. This connection was likely made when officers checking the boys' last known whereabouts discovered the missing vessels, or when marina staff reported the thefts that had occurred overnight. The realization that 6 missing teenagers and 2 stolen boats were linked transformed the case immediately from a routine missing persons investigation into a potential marine disaster. However, by this time, any realistic window for rescue had closed. If the boys had capsized shortly after the engine sounds ceased around 3 a.m. on March 17th, they would have been in the water for more than 30 hours before a search was initiated. In Lake Ontario's March temperatures, survival would have been measured in minutes, not hours. The delayed response has been identified as a critical failure in the handling of the case. Police procedures at the time did not account for the possibility that a group of teenagers might be in immediate life-threatening danger, particularly on the water. The insistence on waiting for parental reports and the dismissal of the girlfriend's early morning calls as alarmism likely cost any chance of finding the boys alive. Even if rescue was impossible by the time they entered the water, an earlier start to the search might have recovered evidence that was eventually lost to time, currents, and weather. Once the connection between the missing boys and the stolen boats was established on Saturday afternoon, police launched a massive search operation that would become one of the largest in the region's history. The effort involved multiple agencies and thousands of volunteers, reflecting the gravity of the situation and the community's shock at the disappearance of 6 local teenagers. The Canadian Coast Guard deployed vessels and aircraft to assist in the search. The Toronto Police Marine Unit joined the effort, contributing specialized watercraft and experienced personnel familiar with Lake Ontario's conditions. On the ground, thousands of volunteers from across southern Ontario converged on the Pickering waterfront. They combed beaches, shoreline areas, and nearby parks for any sign of the boys or debris from the boats. The search extended for weeks, with aircraft scanning the lake surface, boats dragging search patterns, and divers exploring underwater areas near the marina and along likely drift routes. Ultimately, the search yielded virtually nothing. No bodies were recovered, no wreckage from either the Boston whaler or the paddle boat was found, and no personal items belonging to the 6 boys washed ashore. The only physical object definitively linked to the incident was a gas can belonging to the stolen Boston whaler, which was found floating in the lake. In typical drowning scenarios, even in cold water, bodies eventually surface due to decomposition gases, and debris from wrecked vessels usually appears somewhere along the shoreline. The complete absence of such evidence has sustained theories that something other than a simple accident occurred. In 1998, 3 years after the boys disappeared, a potential breakthrough appeared when a pair of distinctive red jeans was found in the Niagara River. Given the river's connection to Lake Ontario, investigators took the find seriously and subjected the jeans to DNA testing. The process, however, dragged on for more than 5 years, an extraordinarily long delay that upset and frustrated the families. When the testing was finally completed, the results showed that the DNA on the jeans did not match any of the missing teenagers. The official or mainstream explanation has long been that the boys, intoxicated and lacking boating experience, ventured out on Lake Ontario in the middle of the night in March, capsized, and succumbed quickly to hypothermia. However, the accident hypothesis struggles to fully account for the almost total absence of physical evidence. This lack has fueled a range of foul play theories. One prominent idea is that the boys may have been confronted at the marina by someone who caught them in the act of trying to steal the motorboat and paddle boat. Frenchman's Bay and some marina areas have at times been connected to organized crime or illicit operations, which has led to speculation that such individuals might have chosen to solve the problem themselves rather than involve police. The 3 unidentified people captured on the security footage after the boys are sometimes placed in this scenario as either direct participants or crucial witnesses who never came forward. Another theory occasionally raised involves the nearby Pickering nuclear generating station. Because the marina lies close to the plant, some have speculated that the boys could have been drawn toward or into water intake channels related to the facility. However, information from those familiar with the plant's operations indicates that the route the boys would have taken from the marina does not naturally bring them into contact with such infrastructure unless they deliberately went sightseeing in that direction. Moreover, any significant obstruction or introduction of large debris or bodies into the intake systems would almost certainly have triggered operational issues or alarms, none of which were reported at the time. As a result, most informed observers treat the nuclear plant hypothesis as unlikely. A less common but persistent speculation is that some or all of the boys may have staged a deliberate disappearance, perhaps to evade legal trouble or family responsibilities. Jay's pending assault and weapons charges and the general rebellious reputation of the group have sometimes been cited to support this notion. Yet the emotional and practical realities push strongly against it. Jay had a newborn daughter and strong family ties, and Danny had just carefully entrusted his cherished chain to his mother rather than taking it with him. There is no evidence of prearranged plans, alternate identities, or financial resources that would sustain such an escape. For these reasons, most analysts view the planned disappearance theory as weak compared with other explanations. The paddle boat's role adds a further wrinkle. If the boys had stolen it the night before as well, it is conceivable that its disappearance was the result of poor mooring or simple negligence rather than being directly linked to the final night's events. In that interpretation, the paddle boat may have broken loose and drifted off independently, leaving the motorboat as the primary vehicle involved in whatever fate befell the boys. Yet that still does nothing to explain the lack of bodies and wreckage. The mystery aspect of this next case doesn't exactly lie in the actual resolution of the crime itself, but rather is tied to a particular item that was found as part of the investigation. Holly Lynn Bobo was a 20-year-old nursing student enrolled at the University of Tennessee at Martin Parsons campus, where she was known for her dedication to her studies and her compassionate nature. By all accounts, Holly was a sweet, shy young woman who came alive once people got to know her. Her friends described her as funny, caring, and deeply committed to her Christian faith. She lived with her family in Darden, Tennessee, an exceptionally rural community in Decatur County in the western part of the state. The county had a population of approximately 11,000 residents in 2011, the kind of place where Interstate 40 brought thousands of travelers through daily, but few ever stopped. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, and serious crime was virtually unheard of. The Bobo household on Swan Johnson Road consisted of Holly's mother Karen, who worked as a teacher and had taught 4th grade in the local school system, her father Dana, her older brother Clint, who was 25 years old at the time, and the family dog Rascal. Holly was also the cousin of country music singer Whitney Duncan, who would later describe her in an exclusive interview with ABC News as being like her little sister. Duncan fought back tears as she described the 20-year-old nursing student, saying, "She's beautiful, she's sweet, she's a good Christian girl, you know, kind of shy, quiet girl until you get to know her, and then she's just funny and sweet, and she's amazing." At the time, Holly had been dating her boyfriend, Drew Scott, who she met back in high school. Scott had given her a promise ring that she wore every day. Their relationship was steady and serious, the kind that families expected would lead to marriage. On the morning that would change everything, Scott would be turkey hunting on Holly's grandmother's property, a detail that would become important in the chaotic hours that followed. April 13th, 2011 began like any other morning for the Bobo family. It was a Wednesday, and Holly had an exam scheduled for her nursing program. Holly woke up at 4:30 a.m. to study for her upcoming exam. Her parents left for work early that morning, leaving Holly and her brother Clint at home. Clint remained asleep in the house as Holly continued her morning routine. At 7:30 a.m., Holly received a phone call from her boyfriend. He had been turkey hunting approximately 20 to 25 miles away from the Bobo home. This phone call would later become a crucial detail as it established Drew's whereabouts and created a timeline that would prove he could not possibly have been the man seen with Holly less than 30 minutes later. 12 minutes after speaking with Scott at approximately 7:42 a.m., Holly made her final outgoing phone call. The content and recipient of this call have never been publicly disclosed, but it marked the last time Holly would initiate contact with anyone. After this point, all incoming calls and text messages to her phone went unanswered. Holly's typical routine on a Wednesday would have been to leave home around 7:55 a.m. to drive to her nursing classes. She would typically take a lunch break around noon, possibly stopping at a restaurant or her grandmother's home in Parsons, but on this particular morning, Holly would never make it to school. Shortly after Holly's last phone call, a neighbor, later identified in some sources as the son of Kathy Wise, heard a scream coming from the direction of the Bobo residence. The scream was alarming enough that the neighbor immediately called his mother to report what he had heard. The mother, in turn, called Holly's mother Karen at work to alert her that something disturbing was happening at the Bobo home. This phone call from the neighbor was the first indication that something was wrong, and it set Karen Bobo's maternal instincts into immediate overdrive. When Karen received the call about the screaming, combined with her recent conversation with Drew Scott about his hunting location, she had every reason to be alarmed. She immediately called home to speak with her son Clint. Meanwhile, at the Bobo residence, Clint was awakened by the sound of the family dogs barking persistently around 7:45 a.m. Groggily emerging from sleep, Clint looked out his window toward the garage area of the family home. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the window, Clint observed his sister Holly near her red Ford Mustang, kneeling down and appearing to be in an intense conversation with a man dressed entirely in camouflage clothing from head to toe. In his testimony during the eventual trial, Clint described the scene saying, "It appeared to be Holly kneeling down and Drew Scott. They looked like they were kneeling down, facing each other in the garage, and they were talking back and forth. Holly sounded very upset and heated." Clint could make out Holly's voice clearly. The tone was emotional and distressed, which led Clint to initially believe that his sister and her boyfriend were having a serious argument, possibly even breaking up. Not wanting to intrude on what he believed was a private, emotional conversation between his sister and her boyfriend, Clint did not immediately go outside. Instead, he called his mother at work to ask if Holly was skipping school that day to go somewhere with Scott. This decision would later be a source of tremendous guilt for Clint. When Clint spoke to his mother and described what he was seeing, Karen responded explosively. Having just spoken with Scott about his hunting location miles away and having received the neighbor's call about screaming, Karen knew with absolute certainty that the man with Holly was not her boyfriend. Karen then gave Clint the following command: "Clint, that's not Drew, get a gun and shoot him." Clint, still believing the man was Scott and confused by his mother's instruction, hesitated. He was still processing what he was seeing and hearing. The cognitive dissonance of the moment created a fatal delay. At some point during or immediately after this phone conversation, Clint looked outside again. This time, he saw the man and Holly walking together toward the woods that bordered the family property. It was at this moment that critical details registered in Clint's mind. The man was noticeably larger than Scott. He was both taller and heavier. Clint later stated that the man was approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall, weighing between 180 and 200 pounds, with dark hair that was long enough to cover his neck and touch his collar. Clint identified the camouflage pattern as either mossy oak breakup or leafy wear. Critically, Clint also described the man's voice as very deep and low, distinctly different from Scott's voice. Clint watched as his sister walked into the woods with this stranger. In some later testimony, he clarified that Holly appeared to be walking with the man either willingly or by coercion. She was not being physically dragged, but she was moving under some form of compulsion. This detail would later lead to unfortunate rumors that Clint had changed his story and speculation about whether he might have been involved, though his family firmly defended Clint, stating he was innocent and not a suspect. The clarification was simply that Holly walked into the woods with the man rather than being carried or dragged, a distinction that made sense given that the man was likely controlling her through threats or the presence of a weapon. When Karen hung up the phone with Clint after telling him to get a gun, she immediately attempted to call police. However, because she was calling from her workplace rather than from home, she reached a dispatcher for the wrong county. The error meant precious minutes were lost as the dispatcher had to figure out the correct jurisdiction and transfer the call to the appropriate authorities. Back at the house, Karen called Clint again and instructed him directly to call the authorities himself from the home phone. Clint, now fully awake and realizing the gravity of the situation, attempted to call both his sister's cell phone and Scott's phone. Neither call was answered. With growing dread, Clint fetched a loaded pistol from inside the house and went outside to investigate. When Clint stepped into the garage area where he had seen Holly and the man kneeling, he made a horrifying discovery. There were bloodstains on the floor near Holly's Mustang. Clint's initial reaction was to hope that the blood might have come from a turkey that Scott had shot while hunting, but deep down he knew the truth. Clint then dialed the police. When they arrived at the Bobo residence 10 minutes later, Holly and her abductor had a significant head start, and the woods of western Tennessee stretched out in every direction. Thousands of acres of dense forest, fields, farms, and rural roads where someone could disappear without a trace. Holly's disappearance triggered one of the most extensive searches in Tennessee history. Approximately 1,200 volunteers participated in the initial search efforts, combing through fields, farms, and woods across western Tennessee. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation declared it the most exhaustive and expensive investigation the agency had ever conducted. During the search, several items belonging to Holly were found scattered throughout the area. On April 15, 2011, just 2 days after her disappearance, her lunchbox was discovered on Bible Hill Road, not far from the Bobo home. Additional items recovered included a receipt with her name on it, a card from school, her cell phone, and its SIM card. Early in the investigation, the TBI focused heavily on a registered sex offender named Terry Britt, who matched the witness description provided by Clint. Britt's home was wiretapped and extensively searched during the course of the investigation, but he was never charged. Former TBI Special Agent Valerie Trout testified that early investigative work included wiretaps and close monitoring of Britt, who was treated as a serious possible suspect for a period of time. However, as the investigation would later reveal, TBI agents admitted to mishandling critical information during the early stages. Special Agent Brent Booth testified in 2017 that investigators received multiple tips about Zach Adams and other men who would eventually be charged, but agents failed to thoroughly investigate these leads early on. Booth acknowledged that agents didn't read reports thoroughly and alibis weren't checked. For more than 3 years after Holly Bobo's disappearance on April 13, 2011, the question of what happened to the 20-year-old nursing student remained one of Tennessee's most haunting mysteries. As late as August 2012, her parents maintained hope that she might still be alive. On Sunday, September 7th, 2014, 3 years after Holly walked into the woods, 2 ginseng hunters ventured into a remote wooded area in northern Decatur County, Tennessee. The location was approximately 20 miles from Holly's home in Darden, situated in dense woods just off Interstate 40 near County Corner Road. The 2 men searching that day were Ernest Larry Stone and his cousin. Stone, described as a very simple country man who has an incredibly big heart, had been ginseng hunting for years and knew the woods of the county intimately. But on this particular Sunday, Stone wasn't just looking for herbs. Like everyone else in the region, he had been haunted by Holly's disappearance. The property where they were searching belonged to Gary Tubbs, who later told media that it wasn't uncommon for people to use his land for hunting without permission, as the 200+ acres of deep woods were vast and difficult to patrol. The specific location where Stone and his cousin were searching was described as extremely remote, accessible only by old logging paths cutting through dense forest. Stone and his cousin had been following a trail of plants deeper into the woods when Stone's attention was drawn to something unusual. There, near a tree in a heavily wooded area, Stone spotted what appeared to be a large bucket, approximately 3 gallons in size, sitting upside down on the forest floor. The object seemed completely out of place in this setting. Stone approached the bucket, and as he got closer, an overwhelming feeling came over him that he would later state gave him cold chills. Stone then picked up the bucket. Different accounts vary slightly about what happened next, but more or less he either looked inside the bucket and saw something that made his stomach turn, or he simply moved the bucket aside without looking within it. Regardless of the exact sequence, what happened next changed everything. Stone felt a powerful, inexplicable compulsion to turn around. When he did, he saw a human skull lying on the ground behind him. Stone's cousin was some distance away, also searching for ginseng. Stone called out to him, but his voice caught in his throat. It took him 3 attempts to call loudly enough for his cousin to hear him. When his cousin arrived and saw what Stone had found, both men stood in stunned silence, staring at the skull and the scattered remains around them. Stone later described the discovery as something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The 2 men immediately called the authorities. Within hours, the remote wooded location was transformed into a crime scene, with Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents, local sheriff's deputies, and forensic specialists descending on the area. And it's this particular part of the case that the original creator of the Iceberg specifically referred to in the actual Iceberg chart. There seems to be some disagreement on what the purpose of the bucket was, but common hypotheses involve it being a marker or potentially containing additional remains. Special Agent Laura Hodge testified about the extensive search process that followed Stone's discovery. Investigators recovered Holly's skull and teeth, several ribs, and 1 shoulder blade. Her skull had a bullet hole in the back of it. The bullet entered the back right side of her head and traveled to the front left side, fracturing her left cheekbone when it exited. Forensic scientists testified that the bullet could have been a .32 caliber or smaller. On September 8, 2014, the TBI officially confirmed that the remains belonged to Holly Bobo. Holly's remains were finally laid to rest in Decatur County in a private family ceremony on January 26, 2018. Nearly 3 years after Holly's disappearance in March and April 2014, before her remains were discovered, law enforcement made a series of arrests. 6 men were ultimately implicated in connection with Holly's disappearance and murder, though only 3 would be prosecuted. The arrests included Zachary Adams, his brother John, Jason Autry, Shane Austin, and brothers Jeffrey and Mark Piercy. The investigation that led to these arrests began in an unusual way. It is unclear what initially led law enforcement to suspect these men, but the chain of events started with Dylan Adams being arrested on unrelated federal weapons charges in 2014. Dylan, who has an intellectual disability with a reported IQ in the low 70s, told police after his arrest that he witnessed Holly alive at his brother Zach's home after her abduction. According to an affidavit for a search warrant, Dylan reported that on April 13, 2011, he went to Zach's residence to get his truck. He claimed to have, quote, observed Holly Bobo sitting in a green chair in the living room wearing a pink t-shirt with Jason standing just a few feet away. He also told police that Zach was wearing camouflage shorts, a black cutoff sleeve t-shirt, and a pair of green Crocs, and that Zach told him, quote, he had Holly and videotaped it. The alleged videotape was never found. Dylan's confession led to the arrests of Zach, Jason, and Shane. All 3 were charged with aggravated kidnapping, first-degree murder, and however, Dylan later recanted his confession and alleged that he was coerced. His family members claimed that investigators, quote, kept him up all night and would not give him anything to eat or drink until he said what they wanted. According to family members, Dylan had limited reading ability, couldn't tell time, and was easily manipulated. The circumstances surrounding Dylan's confession became even more controversial when details emerged at trial. In 2014, after Dylan was arrested on federal gun charges that would have resulted in a lengthy prison sentence, the prosecutor handling the Bobo case arranged a no-jail plea deal on the condition that Dylan live with a retired police officer named Dennis Benjamin, whom Dylan did not know. 5 weeks later, Benjamin called police to report that he had someone in his home who wanted to confess to the murder of Holly Bobo. Dennis Benjamin was a retired Memphis police officer who had become involved in the investigation in 2013 after a call from Holly's mother. At post-conviction hearings in 2025, testimony revealed Benjamin's aggressive investigative tactics. In a February 2014 recording played in court, Benjamin visited trial witness Victor Dinsmore at his Indiana home. In the recording, Benjamin told Dinsmore there were 8 charges hanging over him, including 3 carrying the death penalty, and said, if you can't give me Holly's body, you're fucked. Benjamin described his approach as fishing and blowing smoke. Shane Austin, another man initially charged, was offered immunity in exchange for information regarding the location of Holly's body. Phone records indicated that Austin was in contact with Adams several times on the day of Holly's abduction. However, the immunity agreement was withdrawn after Austin was unable or unwilling to lead investigators to the body. In February 2015, before the case went to trial, Austin was found dead from suicide in a hotel room in Bartow, Florida. Austin's attorney blamed the suicide on continual threats of prosecution and what he called the investigators' witch hunt style approach. Jeffrey and Mark Piercy were arrested in July 2014 and charged with accessory after the fact and tampering with evidence. The charges were based on allegations made by Jeffrey's former roommate, Sandra King, who claimed that Jeffrey showed her part of a video in which Adams assaulted Holly, who was tied up and crying. Both brothers denied a video existed, and Jeffrey denied knowing the other men arrested for the crime. Police analyzed over 20 phones but never found any video. Charges against both Piercy brothers were subsequently dropped, and the narrative described at Zach Adams' trial did not include any mention of their involvement. In September 2017, Zach Adams became the first defendant to go to trial. The prosecution's case was largely circumstantial, as there was no DNA or other forensic evidence tying Adams to the murder. The only forensic evidence conclusively linked to Holly was blood found in her family's garage, which DNA testing confirmed belonged to her. TBI Special Agent Lawrence James testified that there was a good amount of blood at the scene, suggesting a struggle may have taken place. The prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of Jason Autry, who had agreed to testify against Zach in exchange for significant leniency. Jason provided a detailed and disturbing account of Holly's final hours. He testified that he was not involved in the abduction itself, but went to Austin's home to buy illegal substances, where he saw Austin and the Adams brothers disposing of evidence from the crime. Jason said that in the back of his truck, Zach had a body wrapped in a multicolored blanket, and Austin was disposing of evidence in a burn barrel. He claimed that he agreed to help Zach dispose of the body. They drove to a spot along the Tennessee River underneath the Interstate 40 bridge with plans to gut the body so that it would not float in the water. According to Jason's testimony, after unloading the body from the bed of the truck, they realized that Holly was still alive, so Adams shot her in the back of the head. Fearing the noise might have attracted attention, Adams and Jason loaded the body back into the truck, and Adams dropped Jason off. He testified that Adams later said he had dumped the body near a place called Kelly Ridge, though Holly's remains were ultimately found in a different location. The narrative presented at trial suggested that Austin and the Adams brothers went to the Bobo residence to teach Clint how to make a certain illegal substance, an allegation Clint vehemently denied. Holly came out of the home, quote, screaming and hollering, and the men abducted her. The prosecution alleged that Austin was the man Clint described as walking into the woods with his sister, as he was the only one of the men who matched the physical description. The three men were alleged to have Holly in a local barn owned by Austin's grandmother. The prosecution also presented circumstantial evidence linking Zach Adams to the murder. Adams drove a white truck, and a neighbor of the Bobo family had seen a white truck driving rapidly on the morning of the murder. 2 pieces of paper belonging to Holly, a receipt and a note card, were also found on the road where Austin lived, with the receipt discovered 75 feet from his driveway. Several witnesses testified that Adams made statements implicating himself in Holly's disappearance. Adams's then-girlfriend, Rebecca Earp, provided particularly damning testimony, stating that Adams saw a news report about Holly and remarked, "They'll never be able to find her." Rebecca also testified that Adams threatened to tie her up, just like how they did with Holly, and no one would see her again. Zach allegedly threatened his brother Dylan after his arrest, saying he would, quote, put him in a hole beside her if he didn't keep his mouth shut. A gun was also introduced into evidence by the prosecution. A local man, Victor Dinsmore, led police to the weapon, claiming that Austin and Jason sold him the weapon in exchange for substances. The gun was reportedly found in a body of water after 4.5 hours of searching by the West Tennessee Dive Rescue and Recovery Team. However, forensic tests on the weapon failed to find any DNA or fingerprints, and prosecutors were unable to link the gun to the case with ballistics tests. On September 22, 2017, the jury found Zach Adams guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. The following day, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 2 consecutive terms of 25 years for the kidnapping and rape convictions. On January 18, 2018, John Adams pleaded guilty to charges of facilitation of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 15 years for facilitation of first-degree murder and 35 years for aggravated kidnapping to run concurrently, meaning he would serve 35 years without parole. Dylan entered an alfred plea, a type of guilty plea in which the defendant does not admit to the criminal act and maintains innocence, but concedes that the prosecution's case may result in a guilty verdict. Jason Autry, who provided the critical testimony against Zach Adams, received extraordinary leniency. He was sentenced to 8 years for soliciting first-degree murder and facilitating aggravated kidnapping. At his formal sentencing hearing in September 2020, the trial judge praised his testimony as highly credible. However, Autry's freedom was short-lived. Approximately 25 days after his release in September 2020, he was discovered with a stolen firearm. Within 78 days of his release, he was found in possession of additional firearms and ammunition. In November 2022, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of being a felon in possession of guns and ammunition. In June 2024, a federal judge sentenced Jason to 23 years in federal prison for the firearm violations and a supervised release violation. In what could be the most significant development in the case, Jason has since recanted his entire testimony against Zach. In December 2023, he met with Dr. Katie Spurko, a forensic and clinical neuropsychologist, and admitted that he fabricated the entire story. According to Jason, his lawyer warned him before the 2017 trial that he was going to be convicted with 95% certainty on charges in the Bobo case. Faced with the prospect of a death penalty or life sentence, Jason decided to concoct a story to save himself. He claimed he created the entire narrative in his jail cell while reviewing discovery evidence. He used extensive cell phone data to construct a story, essentially recreating his day and adding Holly to it. Jason stated that when he left the trial after testifying against Zach, he felt terrible because he knew that he just put an innocent man in prison. In January 2024, Zach Adams filed a petition known as a Coram Nobis petition seeking to overturn his conviction based on this new evidence. The petition argues that Jason's fabricated testimony was central to Adams' conviction and that without it, the case against him collapses. Post-conviction hearings began in May 2025 and resumed in November. During these proceedings, Jason was subpoenaed to testify, but invoked his Fifth Amendment right and refused to testify under oath about his recantation. Judge J. Bradbury issued an order stating he would not accept Jason's retraction as evidence, ruling it as hearsay.